Greetings gamers, I'm Anto, and today we're going to be building a government. Something a lot of people struggle with is making governments and ruling bodies for their fantasy RPGs. So today I'm going to be walking you through my process for making governments. This topic was actually suggested over on my Discord server. If you aren't already a member of the Icarus Games Discord, I'll leave a link down in the description below. It's a great place to get together with other dungeon masters and players and talk about all things tabletop RPGs. Later in this video, we're going to be making two very different governments with very different stories, but first I want to talk more broadly about what governments are. There are a lot of different types of government, and the one that you choose is going to have a massive impact on your game and your story. But very broadly speaking, the government is a body that makes the rules and the laws of the land on behalf of the citizens. Usually you can define a government by whether the power is held by one person, a small group of people, or by everyone. But we're going to talk about some of the definitions of government before we get started, just so that you've got a good baseline for the terms that we're going to be using. The first thing we're going to talk about is anarchy. If there's no one in charge and everyone is left to their own devices to make their own rules and make their own way in the world, that is anarchy. Anarchy has no real government. Instead, each individual person is concerned with their own self-interest and their self-protection. If you're running a post-apocalypse game, anarchy is a great place to start because it really lends itself to that dog-eat-dog survival of the fittest world. It also works really well for chaotic outer planes in fantasy RPGs, where every individual is just trying to gain power for themselves. Next up, we've got a monarchy. A monarchy is where absolute power lies with the monarch. Usually this is a king or queen who inherits their title through blood, and often, but not always, has some sort of holy prerogative. And often a monarch is depicted as being mainly concerned with the good of the country. If you are playing a D&D game set in the typical fantasy land, chances are you are wildly familiar with playing a game in a monarchy, as most of those games the lands are ruled by kings and queens. Next we have dictatorship. Now, similar to a monarchy, a dictatorship is where the absolute power resides with one individual person, but instead of being concerned with the good of the country, they are almost always concerned with their own power. Usually a dictator will seize power and then is only interested in their own self-interest, and they run for personal power rather than the good of the people or the good of the realm. Dictatorships work really well for darker toned stories and games. Modern and sci-fi based stories and games really lend themselves to dictatorships because a lot of the technologies that we have now or might have in a sci-fi setting really lend themselves to that dictatorship mentality. But you can also mimic what dictators might do in modern or futuristic times with technology by using magic instead, and that's a good way to introduce a dictatorship into a fantasy setting. Give them magic that allows them to emulate what the dictators of a sci-fi world do with technology, but with magic. Next up, we have an oligarchy. Now, an oligarchy is a government made up of a few select individuals that control the power. This might be a nobility, where the lords and the barons, the landed gentry, come together and make laws for the land. Or it could be a church state, where a small body of bishops or cardinals control the land and make the laws. It could be a military oligarchy, where the generals of the army are the ones that make the laws for the land. Or it could be something much more subtle, where a few wealthy individuals control things behind the scenes, despite it looking like another form of government from the outside. An example of an oligarchy I'm probably most familiar with in a D&D setting is the town council, a group of select individuals from around the town. They make the rules for the town, they decide what the laws of the town are, and they decide what's the best interest of the town. Next up, we have representative democracy. Now, this is the system of government that most of you are probably familiar with. The people of the land vote for a representative who goes to some sort of parliament or senate and represents those people in the decision making of the country. Democracies tend to be less common in fantasyland settings than monarchies or empires or dictatorships, usually because the logistics of collecting people's votes without technology over such a vast region is quite difficult. And then finally, we have direct democracy. This is where the government is the people. Every individual person votes on everything, and it is all done based on a majority system, and everyone gets a say in absolute everything. You will usually only find this in much smaller scale examples. For example, the typical town hall meeting where everyone from a town gets together and they vote on an issue with ayes or nays. That is an example of a direct democracy. With small bodies of people, this is in theory a very fair system of government. It's why so many towns use the town meeting, town hall style of voting for local issues. But when you expand and have to deal with an entire country or an entire continent in a fantasyland setting, especially a low magic setting where communication over long distances is really difficult, it's much harder for everyone to have a say in everything as quickly as is needed. Once you know how your government came into power and what your system of government is, you need to understand how they keep their power. Politics is just the process of people gaining power, trying to keep power and trying to steal it from others. So knowing how they keep hold of their power is essential for understanding your government. The number one way a government keeps its power is through taxes. Once you know what kind of government you have, you need to decide on what kind of taxes are collected. Any government needs a pool of resources to draw on to be able to govern effectively, and the most common way of getting those resources is through taxes. Now, the government in your world might collect taxes from its people in the form of coins and currency. They might send tax collectors round to individual towns to collect from the small folk, but that doesn't have to be the only way that they collect taxes. Taxes have often manifested throughout history in the form of livestock and crops. This is a much more realistic way for the small folk who don't have access to a lot of monetary wealth to be able to contribute their taxes to the government. They could take a portion of their crop yield to their local lord, and then their local lord would use that and either send some of that up the chain of government or send money up. A government that commands armies has to feed those armies, so in a lot of cases, crops and livestock become much more valuable than gold. And especially in wartime, you might see the small folk being pressed into giving more and more of their livestock and their crops over to the government to fund the war effort. And then you have service. A government tax could be a tax on labour, on a person's time and skill. This could manifest as having people have to do mandatory labour for government-related works, or in the form of military conscription. In this way, people are providing a resource to their government by dedicating their time and their skill, and they don't have to give over any monetary value or crops or livestock. In reality, you're probably going to want to use a combination of all of those things to create a really realistic looking government economy. Even if they accept all forms of taxes, a government is usually going to favour one over the other, so you want to choose one to be the main form of tax. For example, a country that primarily uses conscription will look very different to one that primarily draws taxes in the form of crops. Once you know what taxes your government collects, you need to think about the public services they offer. All governments need to offer something to the people. If the people aren't getting anything from a government, the government doesn't stay in power. The people revolt. So the government needs to give the people something. But not all public services are equal. Different governments have different priorities, and because resources are not infinite, providing one service usually means you don't provide another. A military oligarchy might provide citizens with weapons and tools to defend themselves from invaders, or build walls to keep those invading armies out. They might make sure that there are soldiers in every town to keep them safe, but that might come at the expense of no centralized education outside of military academies. Your people are safe, but they're not educated. Deciding what public services your government offers is going to tell you a lot about the kind of government that they are. A government that puts its focus into funding roads and public education is going to be very different to one that focuses all of its efforts on defense and its military. Which makes this a perfect time to think about your government's greatest strengths and their biggest weaknesses. What is the main thing that makes them successful and keeps them governing? Is the government rich because the monarch owns large gold mines? Or does the government have the largest army of any nearby nation, and that's how they keep their power, because they operate a conscription service? Knowing what your government's greatest strength is will help inform you on their greatest weakness. Their greatest weakness will usually be the opposite end of the spectrum to their greatest strength, and knowing what their weakness is, you know what they need to lose power. For example, if you had a orc tribe that is ruled by a warlord who is only in power because they have a magical axe, and they have convinced everyone that this magical axe was once wielded by the god of the orcs, and therefore that gives this orc the divine right to rule. Well, if they lost that axe, they would probably lose power. Which brings us to enemies. No one gains power without making enemies along the way. And thinking about who your government's enemies are is going to make for a much more complex story and make your governments much more interesting. A government's enemies are usually going to be opposed to one of the things that we've decided in the previous steps. For example, in a military oligarchy where the government primarily collects taxes through conscription, you might have opponents to the government claiming they are always starting wars to give a reason to continue the conscription and to remain in power. If there are no wars to fight, conscription isn't necessary, the government can't raise taxes, the government's strength means nothing. Thinking about all these aspects is going to give you a much more intricate and interesting government. It'll give you a much more complex story, and it will be much more interesting to your players than just saying this country is ruled by a queen and that be the end of it. In this video, I want to make two different empires. I want to make the Empire of Senegal and the Parthian Empire. While both of these are empires, they take very different approaches to how they govern their people. So we'll start with the Sengali Empire. I recently worked on the map of Senegal as part of a Making a Fantasy map making series, which you can see up here. And as part of that, I worked on the natural resources of the island of Senegal. So these are the questions that I want to answer for my different governments. Who's in charge? How did they get into power? How did they keep power? What do they do for their people? How do they tax their people? Who are their opponents? What's their biggest strength and what's their biggest weakness? And as I say, we're going to start with the Empire of Senegal. So I'm going to load up the map of the Empire of Senegal that we made during our fantasy map making series. And you can see that I've overlaid my provinces as well as my resources, and that's going to be really helpful for us in determining some of these key questions. So let's just zoom in a little bit here and we'll switch back over to the questions. So who is in charge of the Empire of Senegal? Well, when we were making our map, I decided that the Kaze Feng clan, the Tiger clan, were the Emperor's clan. So we know that the Kaze Feng province is the ruling province, and that is where the Emperor's seat of power is. How did they get into power? Well, I think that they probably conquered their way into power. There was probably a period of strife and disruption, and the Kaze Feng have expanded outwards and seized power rather than inheriting it. So we'll go in and we'll enter in that information. The Kaze Feng clan, how did they come into power? They seized power at the end of a period of strife. How do they keep their power? Now this is a really important question. Looking at the map, the very first thing that I know is that other than our two unincorporated provinces, these two large white ones, Kazefeng probably has the largest province, which means they probably have the largest army. So we can go real simple and say that the Kazefeng keep their power because they have the largest army. Next, we need to think about what they do for the people. What does the Tiger clan do for the other clans that keeps them in power? As the Sengal Empire is loosely based on feudal Japan, I want to lean into that a little bit and think about the Tokugawa shogunate. The Tokugawa shogunate came after a period of civil wars, and one of the things that the people of Japan benefited from during that period was a time of relative peace. So I think I want to mimic that with the Kazefeng. Maybe prior to coming to power, Sengal was embroiled in a variety of wars between the clans, and perhaps Kazefeng have overpowered some of the other clans and rallied them all together, and they stay in power now because they offer peace. So what do they do for their people? They offer their people a period of peace after decades of war. Thinking about what that might look like practically, maybe as part of their ruling, they insist that the rulers of other clans meet to discuss things. Maybe that's something that hadn't been happening before. There's lots of different ways to approach this, but we have that baseline of knowing that they offer peace, and that's what they're doing for their people. They're keeping the peace. So how do they tax their people? I think that we can look at our map and we can see that almost all the provinces have access to some sort of natural resource. So I think the easiest way for them to tax people is through resources rather than through money. So a tax on resources such as crops and natural materials like metals. Next, we want to think about who are their opponents, and that's really easy. We've got a whole bunch of provinces here to choose from. Looking at the map, I think that we have a couple of different options here. I think the Kuren clan up here on these islands, they are made up primarily of Kenku, whereas the rest of the island is predominantly human. So I think that there's a strong case there for the Kenku people of the Kuren province to want to secede from the Sengali Empire. So we can add the Kuren province as one of their enemies. But it's a lot more interesting if they have a couple of different enemies. So we can look at some of our other clans and think about who might want to remove the Tiger clan from power. I think the most obvious choice is the Yangshin province, the Serpent clan. As I discussed when we were making this map, originally the Yangshin had much more land, and their land is what was taken by the Tiger clan during the Emperor's rise to power. So it makes sense that the Serpent clan would want to see the Tiger clan taken out of government. Next, we need to think about what the biggest strength of our empire is. Again, I want to use my map for this, and looking at it, I can see that the empire has a lot of raw materials right on their doorstep. They have 2 whole mountain ranges to draw from, as well as a vast reserve of oil. So their primary resource in terms of strength is going to be those natural resources and the manpower they can muster over the size of their province. So if they've got a lot of natural resources and a lot of troops, what's their weakness? Well, their weakness is that they are positioned in such a way that a lot of the other provinces are cut off from them. They only have primary contact with 2 of the main provinces and 1 of the unincorporated territories. Everyone else is separate from them, and if they wanted to invade the Himitsu province, for example, they would almost certainly have to do that by sea. They couldn't march across the land, it would take far too long. So their biggest weakness is that they're relying on the leaders of these other clans to keep order and to remain loyal. Otherwise, the entire country would go back into chaotic war. So their greatest weakness is their isolation. They are cut off from a lot of the other clans and rely on the clan leaders to keep the peace and to remain loyal. So that is the Senegal Empire. To show you how these questions can be so useful, I want to use them for another empire, for the Parthian Empire, that's going to play a major role in my upcoming Ashk campaign, just so you can see how these questions can prompt such different results. So for the Parthian Empire, who is in charge? Well, that is Emperor Alexios Vasilis. How did the emperor get into power? They were voted in by the Parthian Senate to replace the previous empire. Next, we need to decide how the emperor stays in power. I would say that they stay in power by keeping the people happy. The Parthian Empire, in a lot of ways, is quite modern. In that sense, they remain in power by actively choosing things for the good of their people, So how do they keep their power? By providing benefits to their people. And what do those benefits look like? What do they do for their people? Now, the Parthian Empire's biggest goal is to abolish slavery throughout the entire world. They want to get rid of all slavery and free all the slaves. So they keep their people free from slavery. Another thing the Parthian Empire does is that they provide a basic income for all of their citizens in their homeland. The way they are able to provide this basic income is through their tax system. The Parthian Empire doesn't tax the people of Parthia. It only taxes the foreign nations that they have conquered, and they do this in a variety of ways. So they seize control of the means of production. So when the empire rolls into a new territory and conquers it, all of the mines that mine for precious metals and gems, all the natural resources like that, they are controlled by the Parthian Empire, and they take those resources, that iron, that gold, and distribute it across the empire where it's needed. They also tax their conquered peoples, so if they move into a new country and take over that country, they tax them through crops and livestock and through coin-based taxing as well. So who are the opponents of the Parthian Empire? Well, a lot of the nations that they conquer will have elements that are opposed to them because they've been conquered. But the primary reason why a country would oppose the Parthian Empire is that the Parthian Empire is monotheistic. They worship the god Sophos, the grandfather. In my setting, he is supposedly the first god, and part of becoming an Parthian citizen is to renounce all other deities and to accept Sophos. So one of the really big points of contention with a lot of nations against Parthia is that to join the empire you have to renounce your old gods, and that's something that a lot of people just aren't willing to do. So their opponents are primarily people of other faiths. The biggest strength of the empire is the size of the army it can muster. They run conscription services throughout the empire, and that lets them generate huge armies. But the greatest strength is also their biggest weakness. The Parthian Empire is massive, and ruling such a huge area is a near impossible task. Little bouts of insurrection will be constantly popping up. You will get local leaders that decide that the empire hasn't paid them much attention in a long while, so why don't I just become my own ruler? So the size of the empire and how fragmented it is a real weakness to the empire as a whole. If a nation was to secede, you could cut off an entire part of the empire from the heartland really easily. And their greatest weakness is also how restrictive they are on religion. It's what causes the majority of people to rebel against them, to kick back against their advancements. So I hope that you can see by answering these questions, we end up with a government that's much more interesting than just saying this country is ruled by a king. We know how that monarch might get there. We know what they do to keep power, who their allies might be, who their enemies are, and what they do for their people. That allows us to have much more politically complex games. If we want to run a game or tell a story that is really political and involves a lot of political intrigue, these are the sorts of things we need to know to make that a rich and meaningful experience for our players. By answering those questions that we just looked at, you can get a really good baseline for who your government are and what their agenda is, what their system of rule is. And I'll leave a PDF link down in the description, a fancy document that has all those questions to help you kickstart your ideas and get a sense for what the government in your game is going to look like. I hope that you found this video helpful and it's inspired you to think more deeply about the type of governments you include in your games. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps our overlords here at YouTube know that this video is useful and therefore they push it to more people so more people can see the content. But until next time, happy gaming. Thanks for watching. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to stay up to date with all my new releases. I release new videos every other Friday. You'll find more videos just over here, and if you enjoy what I do, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Just $5 a month gets you access to loads of extra content to use in your RPG campaigns. But until next time, happy gaming.